Hello everyone, Loremaster of Sotek here, back with the last episode for this week of the Chaos Dwarf Q&A. We are definitely not anywhere close to being done with this series. We've still got quite a bit to go, and that will continue next week on Monday, but this weekend we're obviously going to be busy with some other things. So let's go ahead and hop into our questions for today and knock it out. So we are continuing, I believe, with the worldwide subcategory. And our first question today is, what are the best and worst acts the Chaos Dwarfs have ever committed? I would have to say that the best act... that's kind of a tough one, isn't it? The best thing you could say they've done is that they have made notable steps into taming the Darklands. So, although they certainly did not intend it, they have unwillingly made the Darklands safer for those who seek to travel across it, either by slaying or dominating many of the titanic and nightmarish monsters that haunt those lands. Obviously, this was not their intent, as they are not a generous people, but it's just kind of a byproduct of them establishing their empire and trying to make a hostile land a little bit more manageable. But I would actually argue that traveling across the Darklands to get to Cathay in the Far East is much easier than it would have been if the Chaos Dwarfs were not there. Just because the Darklands would probably be owned entirely by greenskins, and there would be a lot more giant monsters roaming about that had no direct threat or race that was keeping them oppressed or out of the way. So I would say that's their best thing. The worst thing is entirely subjective, considering the sheer amount of horrific nonsense they have unleashed upon the world. I suppose if I had to pick out a single event as the worst act the Chaos Dwarfs ever did, it would be their bargain with Hashut. As dwarfs, the honorable but admittedly sucky thing to do would have been to accept their fate and simply fight to the bitter end. Instead, they gave in to fear and hatred and struck a deal that unleashed a terrifying and nightmarish empire upon the world to further the desires of this mysterious, monstrous entity. Next question. Who is the most sadistic race? The Dark Elves or someone else? You know, honestly, I would say that the Dark Elves are probably the most sadistic race, save for perhaps the demons of Slaanesh themselves. The Chaos Dwarfs are cruel and cold monsters, but they're far more calculating in their evil. Where the Dark Elves derive incredible pleasure in the suffering of others and go out of their way to milk every last scream and whimper from their victims, the Chaos Dwarfs simply see everyone as a resource to be exploited, kind of like how the American economy does. For the Zharr, they're not so much interested in your suffering as they are in using you up until you have nothing left of value to give them. At which point your blood, soul, and flesh will be utilized, which results in your death as a side effect. But many of the Chaos Dwarfs are not they're not, I would say, overly sadistic. Like, they're more interested in obliterating you as fantastically and instantly as possible, not in tying you down and seeing how much they can cut you before you bleed out, like a Dark Elf would. You know, the Chaos Dwarfs very rarely flay people alive, unless it's someone that really pissed them off, like which created an incident like Flayed Rock. But in general, they're just far more interested in industry and productivity, and they don't really waste their time on things like torture. Obviously, there are some exceptions. The character we spoke about the other day, the Gorth the Cruel, who was Zatan the Black's master. Those two are noted for their wanton cruelty, but I would say they're an exception, not the rule. Next question. It has been mentioned in Ikit lore that he toured the workshops of Zharr Naggrund. Did he work with the Daemon-smiths? Yes, that appears to still be canon, though any further details are non-existent. It's not clear how he managed to negotiate that bargain or what price he paid to convince the Chaos Dwarfs to let him in. Must have been one hell of an offer, and I would say they definitely did not teach him to Daemon-smith, because Ikit Claw does not know how to Daemon-smith, but they apparently were willing to exchange secrets with him, which significantly enhanced his understanding of engineering. Alright, moving on. Do the Chaos Dwarfs allow trade or travelers through their lands? If so, do they inflict tolls? If not, how do people cross through High Pass and take the Road of Skulls without being captured? The Chaos Dwarfs are not known to allow traders of any sort through their lands. Avoiding the gaze of the Dawizar, or at least taking a large enough army to make them think twice about attacking you, is key to surviving the journey across the Darklands. It is actually quite noticeable on the maps that show the main trade route to the east, which is the Silver Road. This route passes north of the tall plateau from which the Tower of Gorgoth watches on, and then splits wide around the Black Fortress, depending on whether you want to follow the Ivory Road to Cathay or go south on the Spice Route to End. As for High Pass and the Road of Skulls, in the modern day, that's not a route anyone sane takes, as it's only going to lead you to an inevitable death unless you are stupid lucky. The Road of Skulls, back in earlier editions, was established as like the first discovered trade route to Cathay by some entrepreneurial explorers from Telea. However, during that edition, the Road of Skulls route seemed to be like the only way that they seemed to suggest you could go to Cathay over land. And for whatever reason, it seems like the Silver Road and the Spice Road, or the Ivory Road and the Spice Road, had not yet been established. And I would guess this had to do with the Ogre's lore. When the Ogre Kingdom's lore got expanded, they really focused on like drawing multiple routes through the Ogre Kingdoms to explain how they got so wealthy, and that people constantly came through the Ogre Kingdoms trying to get to End in Cathay. And that was not the case back in 5th edition in the Dogs of War book, which showcased Telea going over the Ogre Kingdoms and through the Eastern Steppes to come down on Kislev from the north, Cathay from the north, which just caused some weird issues. In the modern lore, I do not know of any records that anyone takes the Road of Skulls to get to Cathay anymore. It seems like the infinitely safer route, and faster route to be frank, is to take the Ivory Road or to take the Silver Road, which then splits into the Ivory Road and the Spice Road, or Spice Route. That being said, because, I mean, just nowadays, High Pass is honestly not a place a lot of people go out of. It's from the west. It's a place that people come in from the east. It is one of the most preferred invasion routes of the Hordes of Chaos. And the Road of Skulls itself is actually something that's explained a fair bit in Gotrek and Felix, which has a book called The Road of Skulls. Essentially, though, the lore that they add to the road itself is that this is a route that was created by the ancestor god Grimnir. Because near the end of the Great Cataclysm, when like demons were just all over the damn place, and it was a war that lasted for well over 1,000 years of just demons trying to wipe out all life, Grimnir finally got to the point where he learned a little bit from Kalidor Dragon Tamer. Kalidor kind of mentioned a theory he had to Grimnir about where the demons were coming from, which was, the north. So Grimnir decided that he was going to fight his way up to the very realm of chaos itself and kick the crap out of the Chaos Gods. So he took his axes and he marched north to go fight, gave one of his axes to, I think, his son, and then he kept fighting until he vanished. And the Road of Skulls, supposedly, is the road he took against the endless tides of demons, where he fought them all the way back to the realm of chaos, and essentially was like a cork into a stream, where he blocked up the flow of demons that were trying to get out and go be useful in other places. So the Road of Skulls are the skulls of all those demons and monsters he supposedly slayed on his way north. In the modern lore, it functions primarily as an invasion route, and it is a damn cursed one at that. It is not a route you would take to anywhere safe or interesting if trade is what you're after. The best case scenario is, in the modern day, is if you were like from Kislev or something and you were really desperate for some reason, you could go through High Pass and then cut your way south across the Darklands. Actually, I think you'd be more in the Wolflands at that point, until you reach the Silver Road, but doing so is incredibly difficult. And impossible if you're not super lucky, especially because you're passing by a lot of really significant and dangerous places. Yeah. So I would say that for the most part, people don't go through High Pass anymore. That being said, the plain of Zorn Uzkul, which is the plateau that Uzkalak is on, it's a big place, and Uzkalak is literally this, like, it's on the very southern tip of it. It's not very high up, so you could very easily cross Zorn Uzkul and never see a Chaos Dwarf, as long as you don't wander too south on the plateau. Which, honestly, you'd probably want to go more north, because you'd be safer to use the mountains as cover. That way you're not as exposed to monsters or roving bands of chaos troops or hobgoblins and stuff like that. But just going into the Eastern Steeps is immensely dangerous, because after the Gospodars were kicked out, the Eastern Steeps is now modernly dominated by hobgoblins, the Hobgoblin Empire, or the Hobgoblin Khanate, and then the Kurgan, which the Kurgan are like, you really don't want to fight the Kurgan or run into them. You can also run into the Hung up there, but you don't want to fight any of those guys. It's just not it would be just way safer to go through the Darklands, because you just avoid marching up and knocking on Chaos's doorstep. Alright, the next question we have, is there anything of interest to the Chaos Dwarfs and the Karaz Ankor? Do they ever attempt to capture Dwarf Karaks? Definitely. Absolutely. Vengeance is first and foremost their primary objective. The Chaos Dwarfs have an extreme desire to capture dwarfs alive, so they can inflict impossibly cruel torment upon their kin, who they accuse of abandoning them. Plus, they really get their rocks off, showing off their superiority by smashing down a Karak. That is like the sweetest morsel you could ever offer a Chaos Dwarf, is destroying a Karak. But there's quite a bit of mineral wealth, runic lore, and all sorts of trinkets that the Zharr would be beyond interested in having for themselves. So yes, they definitely would like to capture Dwarf Karaks and fight them. They just know that it would be a very costly expenditure, and so very rarely go to do it themselves. Do the dwarves have any famous or notable grudges against the Chaos Dwarfs? Probably, but the issue is that the Dawi do not speak of the Chaos Dwarfs under most circumstances, as their sheer existence is an unfathomable insult to the ancestor gods and everything the dwarves hold dear. To say they have a grudge against the Chaos Dwarfs does not cover it. There is no written word against them, as to do so might suggest that the Zharr's offense could somehow be avenged by anything less than pure and utter annihilation. So long as the Zharr live and any sign of their empire remains, the hatred between these two empires will never be settled. But I have never heard of particular entries about the Zharr in the Great Book of Grudges. It's totally possible they're in there, and the dwarves just don't talk about it. But, I mean, when it comes to the Chaos Dwarfs, the Dawi policy is literally to just stop talking. Like, they get really quiet. And if you're an outsider and you bring up the Chaos Dwarfs, unless you've got a really good reason, that could easily get your nose broken, or worse. Alright, and then the last question for the worldwide section what happened between Grimgor Ironhide and the Chaos Dwarfs? So before I get into this question, I will note that someone, I need to go back and look into it, but someone in a comment section claimed they saw a page in a book that talks about Grimgor escaping from a Chaos Dwarf fleet, but I have read many books, and I have never heard of this, and I need to go back and kind of like look into that and all that stuff. So I'm going to assume that that person was mistaken, and if it turns out they were correct and I end up finding what they're talking about, A, that would be an amazing find, and B, I will do an update on this question in the kind of like the second to last video I'll do in the series, which is the kind of going back and going over questions where I made mistakes and people corrected me. So, from my understanding and the research I've done, from the context clues that are scattered across the history of Grimgor Ironhide and what little we know about him, it is heavily suggested that Grimgor was among the original Black Orcs, who 2,000 years ago were created and enslaved by the Zharr. The main evidence for this is that Ironhide is pretty damn old and has quite the bone to pick with the Chaos Dwarfs, which he settles during the end times when Ironhide leads his Wa into the Darklands and ends up razing Zharr Naggrund itself to the ground along with the rest of the Chaos Dwarf Empire. Also, his infamous axe, Gitsnik, is an incredibly potent weapon that bears markings at having been crafted by the Chaos Dwarfs themselves, likely looted by the war boss himself during the final Great Slave Rebellion in Zharr Naggrund, when the Greenskins nearly won, but were ultimately defeated due to the betrayal of the Hobgoblins. This is also where he probably lost his missing eye, because by the time he shows up in the old world, he's already the Grimgor we know, in that he is missing one of his eyeballs. Where he went after this, during all that huge time gap, is anyone's guess. I would not be surprised if Grimgor initially went to the Mountains of Morn and smashed around there for a good number of centuries before finally fighting his way back across the Darklands and taking up residence in the World's Edge Mountains. But that seems to be the history of it. Though this is mostly speculation, as the only significant evidence is Grimgor's axe, which although is 100% a Chaos Dwarf invention, well, at least the actual like bladed part of it, it could have just been taken from any number of places or even traded for. Personally, I really like the idea of Grimgor being one of the Chaos Dwarf's oldest and most arrogant creations that ends up coming back to doom them. That seems like a very fitting and thematic situation for those entities. I don't know, for me, it's pretty fitting. Alright, the next section we're going into is called The Darklands and the Monsters Within. Our first question for this section is, are Lamasu related to Manticores? Who would win in a fight? The Lamasu are actually believed to be a mutated cousin of the Great Taurus. Both are bull-like flying monstrosities that are quite large, in the same size category as manticores and griffins, rather than pegasi, for instance. And as for who would win in a fight, honestly, if it comes to the point where a manticore is trying to kill the Lamasu, something very unusual has happened. The Lamasu are not rampaging beasts like most monstrous creatures, but instead devious schemers who are just as intelligent as the Chaos Dwarf sorcerer prophets who often ride them into battle. They are limited but powerful sorcerers, so infused with the essence of magic that their very breath creates a sorcerous miasma around them that easily deflects the spells of even the mightiest enemy mages. Should a Lamasu be driven to war, it is far more likely to use its sorcery and clever words to convince other beasts to fight in its stead. So going after one of these malefic creatures is often a death sentence, as you'll have to fend off great Taurus, wyverns, and other monsters that have been lured out to devour you. However, It is interesting that you picked the Manticores specifically, because those maddened beasts are so infamously bloodthirsty and crazed that they can ignore the ensorcelled tongue of the Lamasu, lunging into attack instead of being subjugated. Should violence break out, honestly, the Lamasu would be very hard-pressed to claim victory, though its ability to use magic may see it to victory, if it can survive the initial onslaught of fangs, claws, and venomous tail strikes. In a one-on-one, I'd actually say the Manticore has the advantage when it comes to just a straight-out fight. The next question. What is the ecology and climate of different areas of the Darklands? So, the Darklands are a miserable wasteland, made up of ever-shifting ash deserts beneath black burning clouds created by the endless plumes of smoke belched into the sky by thousands of volcanoes. This land has never been one of life and growth, instead a stagnant desolation of smoldering flame. The only features that break up the endless plains are treacherous tar pits and still pools of oil, steaming lava often forced up to the earth by the churning, deep ground that can unleash rivers of bubbling magma across the land. It is a place possessed by howling winds, which carry bright embers of flame and storms of razor-sharp black sand that can flay exposed flesh from a man in an eye blink. The temperature is often hellish hot. The toxic gases spewed by countless rents in the earth, trapped beneath the roiling sky, lance through with constant red lightning. Just a delightful sounding place, isn't it? At the center of the Darklands resides the Great Plateau, dominated by the Tower of Gorgoth. The black rock of this elevated space having been honeycombed over the centuries by countless mines that extend deep into the crust of the earth in the name of endless industry. Volcanoes flank both east and west of this raised land, and they are surrounded by a cluster of scorched peaks and miserable lowlands. South, across the desolation of Asgore, stands the fiery Ash Ridge Mountains, a staggering number of volcanoes that constantly thunder with endless eruptions and coat the surrounding lands in a rain of ash that may well never end. On the other side of these wrathful peaks lies the famous Plain of Bone, the ancient graveyard of titans long forgotten before even the coming of the dark gods themselves. This is where many mighty beasts journey to meet their end, drawn by some inner calling to embrace their eternal rest alongside countless number of their kin. This includes the legendary dragons, some specimens so large that entire cities could be constructed within their jaws. Heading to the western border of the Darklands, it's mostly marked by foothills that start the ascent into what we know as the World's Edge Mountains and lead into the old world beyond. Meanwhile, in the east, the River Ruin marks the border of the Ash Deserts, that river stained red and yellow with filth, laden with noxious sediments. Its steaming water is thick and poisonous, with a foul yellow cloud that hangs about the river, and its banks are choked with drifts of spectacularly colored pollutants. To the north lies Zharr, that sunken plain at the heart of which lies Zharr Naggrund, the capital of the Chaos Dwarf Empire. This nightmarish land is what the Chaos Dwarfs would envision for the entire world, for it is littered with the scars of vast open mines, fiery rivers of magma, ash dunes, and stagnant pools of foamy yellow and blood red. For thousands of years, this land has suffered at the hands of the Dawizar. Vast quantities of oil and tar pumped up to the surface to form lakes, while black mounds created from the immense amount of coal dug from beneath pile all around the landscape. The Plain of Zharr is a pockmarked horror of constant industry, and a stark reminder of what waits the unwary should they fall to the Chaos Dwarfs. In the distant north, of course, is Zorn-Uz-Kul, but we've already covered that extensively in other questions. The brief summary is this land is essentially a frigid wasteland, deeply infected with the corruption of chaos, both in the air and soil. Upon it lies the cold water that journeys south before tumbling over the Falls of Doom to form the River Ruin, which remains relatively pure until suffering from the attentions of Zharr Naggrund itself, which it passes through. Zharr Naggrund was built around the River Ruin. Lastly, to the furthest south lies the Sea of Dread, the coastlands more akin to a toxic mire or swamp than a proper beach, just as lifeless and cursed as the plains north of it until crossing out of the Darklands east over the River Ruin and into the Haunted Forest. And then the last question for today will be, what other monsters live in the Darklands? Which of these are utilized by the Chaos Dwarfs, and how do they catch them? I'm aware the last question we did was about ecology, but this time we're going to answer this very specifically, because the only thing in the Darklands besides the various races hanging out in their fortresses is monsters. Just so many monsters. There's not a lot of minor, small species running around. It's just big, scary things. This actually plays into a major reason of why the Darklands are such a hellscape and difficult to cross, because the only thing that manages to really thrive here are horrific titans and monstrous beasts who can shrug off such a harsh environment and survive by feasting on each other or the occasional terrified army. You're not going to be hunting deer or other simple, small creatures. You're going to be dealing with these guys. So, let's go down the list of creatures known to inhabit these lands. But it's worth noting there has been no successful attempt by any scholar to accurately identify every species present in the Darklands, as many of them kill any unfortunate enough to encounter them. So the apex predator, or the dominant species of the Darklands, are massive burning bulls known as the Great Taurus. These monstrous creatures are rage and savagery incarnate, more akin to elemental manifestations of the Darklands than actual beasts of flesh and blood. No two are exactly alike, but all bear the semblance of a huge, winged demonic bull whose flesh burns with the intensity of a living furnace, sufficient to wreathe it in smoke and spark the ground afire beneath its hooves. These monsters burn so hot that arrows are incinerated before connecting, and steel blades will melt in its presence. They are infamous for appearing in the skies as ash-trailing shadows that circle around their prey before plummeting as red-wreathed comets. Don't underestimate these monsters. They're more than capable of equaling a dragon in ferocity and strength, and if anything are more dangerous due to their burning bodies making them quite difficult to wound. Did I forget to mention they're completely immune to all magical flames, such as from the Lore of Fire? In fact, they can even devour that to heal themselves. Wonderful. There is a variant of their species worth mentioning that's even more terrifying than the regular Great Taurus, known as the Bale Taurus. The Bale Taurus are even more ancient and are notably tougher than their kin, but most importantly, they have the ability to concentrate the raging flames around their body into a stream of fiery devastation, essentially unleashing fire breath like dragons do. As for how the Chaos Dwarfs managed to secure these creatures, the greatest of the servants of Hashut have the ability to dominate the wills of the Taurai, using the sorceries taught to them by their father in darkness. This does suggest some notable connection between the bull-like monsters and Hashut himself, doesn't it? These beasts have to be kept under control, though, and as such only serve as mounts to the mightiest sorcerer prophets, who can weave the most complex and dangerous of spells to mount these beasts without succumbing to their incinerating heat or voracious appetites. When not in use upon the battlefield, the Crimson and Bronze Taurus are kept in infernal stables beneath the great temple of Zharr Naggrund, which are heated by sacrificial fires kept burning day and night to appease the sacred beasts. Next up is the Lamasu, which we spoke about a bit already. These bizarre creatures are a mutated offshoot of the Great Taurus, possessing similar bull-like features, but saturated by raw magic instead of burning flames. They have faces very similar to that of the Dawizar themselves, which has led some of the sorcerer prophets to suggest that they are in fact simply heavily mutated ancient Chaos Dwarfs, but this seems very unlikely. Despite being monsters, as we discussed earlier, the Lamasu are devious and highly intelligent, able to match wits with the sorcerer prophets of Hashut, whom they will forge pacts with. They are also gifted but limited wizards themselves, able to unleash spells from the lores of death, fire, or shadow. The sorcerous breath they exhale can be deadly, and functions very nicely as a breath weapon, while also, of course, producing the miasma that deflects spells and can even disable the magical properties of magic weapons. It is often suggested by scholars who study them that the Lamasu are the true masters of the Darklands, as their sinister charisma is often used to convince other monsters and beasts to fight their battles for them. The Great Taurus rules supreme only because the Lamasu allow it. They will often agree to serving as a mount for a sorcerer prophet of Hashut, but whether rider or mount is truly the master of the partnership is never obvious. Moving on, those are the only monsters that you would be likely to run into among the Chaos Dwarfs and their armies. But there are, of course, many wild monsters that roam the Darklands we shall explore now. Not to say the Chaos Dwarfs couldn't dominate or control these beasts, they just haven't shown up in a Chaos Dwarf roster thus far. Many I have gone over in other series, such as the Monstrous Arcanum I did back in October, like the Dreadmaw for instance. I'll actually have that episode linked here and down below, so you can check it out if you haven't already. The Dreadmaw is a monster I think would actually work really well in a Chaos Dwarf army. One thing that's kind of interesting to note is that there's actually Famir, very close to the Darklands, or technically within the Darklands. They actually have a series of strongholds within the foggy banks around the southern portions of the River Ruins, south of the Black Fortress, where they kind of inhabit that border between the Darklands and the Haunted Forest. Beyond that, the lands are also haunted by more common monstrous brutes, such as Manticores, Chimeras, Wyverns, Cockatrice, Hydras, and Pegasi. Most of these creatures live and roam around the peaks of the mountains and volcanoes, though, as opposed to the wide open ash deserts. So as long as you stay far away from the mountains, you should be relatively safe. Finally, there are dragons. As one might expect from the Plane of Bones being so close by, the Darklands is one of the most heavily saturated lands when it comes to dragons outside of Ulthuan. But these are not the brave, noble beasts that fight alongside the elves, but instead primordial titans that arrogantly crush entire battalions beneath their tread. Fire dragons are plentiful here, but there have also been sightings of carmine and black dragons among many other variants. Those who roam the Darklands are often the largest and most deadly of their kind, for only the most ancient beasts are able to stand strong here among the many other threats. A good example is the Nightmare Dragon, worshipped by the ghouls in the ruined fortress of Vorag, known as Omdra the Dread, a wicked beast who could summon Dreadmaws to serve her, and was capable of wielding the lore of death better than most lore masters of that sinister lore. However, there is a breed of dragon unique to the Darklands. Those titanic horrors known as magma dragons. These are without a doubt the most powerful type of dragon in the entirety of the Warhammer universe. Cruel lords of dark flame that, similar to the black dragons of Naggaroth, are already unstoppable beasts, but the Chaos Dwarfs made the extreme error of corrupting their species even further. Centuries ago, the masters of the Tower of Gorgoth once captured the fire dragon Hagdar. who is one of the oldest dragons in existence to still be alive. The Dawi Zharr bound him with ensorcelled chains, and the sorcerer prophets turned Hagdar into a living vessel, capable of sustaining possession by a demon. This experiment would later prove to be a massive step forward in the creation of the Kadai. This corrupted dragon evolved from this perverse act upon his body, growing thick armored plates across everything that he was, and allowing him to master the lore of fire to such an extent that no mortal wizard can rival his ability. Eventually, he shattered free of his restraints, Hagdar the Magma Dragon proceeding to destroy much of the Tower of Gorgoth and the surrounding lands before finally returning to his lair beneath the Ass Ridge Mountains, where he occasionally emerges from to this day. To explain the overall situation with magma dragons, they are terrifying. Not only are they the largest breed of dragon, able to grow to such immense size that they can trample the likes of Star and Chaos dragons beneath their bulk, they are also the living definition of invulnerable, radiating an aura of heat that makes them immune to all forms of flame and incinerates or melts anything that attempts to wound them. The largest of their kind are deadly combatants in the extreme, more than capable of tearing apart the likes of war mammoths with ease, and match them in size and toughness with a heavy coating of immense scales stronger than steel to boot. Oh, did I mention they regenerate? Yeah, these disgustingly powerful gods-made flesh recover from even the most dire of wounds within seconds, and have been known to regrow entire limbs in a battle. When combined with their immunity to flame, this makes for a rather terrifying combination of near invulnerability. Haha, I bet you thought I was done, didn't you? Nah, because we have to talk about their breath attack. See, instead of belching out flames like a normal drake, these brutes instead unleash something called brimstone fire. This is a sulfurous, poisoned flame that will blind and ignite anything it doesn't outright incinerate. This breath attack is so horrifically strong that it makes the famously powerful fire breath of the star dragons look like a pocket lighter in comparison. Plus, if it doesn't kill you, it will debilitate you, most commonly by blinding you or just utterly wrecking your lungs. This is how magma dragons actually prefer to hunt, the go-to snack for these creatures being manticores and chimeras. They come up on them and blind them with their breath attack and then tear them apart to get busy eating. So yeah, thankfully the magma dragons hate everyone, so it's not something one would expect to see in an army, but who knows what the future holds. Perhaps the Chaos Dwarfs can work out some kind of deal. And that's going to be it for today. I went way over time. Thank you all so much for watching. I'll see you next time. Bye!